Dr. El-Hibri, I saw you nodding when Dalia was saying that Muslim women are ahead of where we think they are.
I'd like to comment on that. Part of what we really need to do, and maybe you'll do it next time, is to understand the whole issue of women's liberation in the Middle East or gender equity in historical terms. For example, I don't know how many in the US are aware that the Egyptian women in the early 1900s had a wonderful women's movement and had quite impressive writings, which affected the whole area. And there were male jurists who supported them, just like today there are male jurists who support our work here. Then the whole area went into some sort of maybe deep sleep, maybe not so deep. And now, when these women talk, whether in response to your questions or in response to conferences that Karamah has held, for example, in Bahrain in 2008 on domestic violence, these women speak out. And they speak out because, because they are empowered. I don't think in general we can say they are yet empowered, but they are emboldened. They are emboldened to speak because they think that now if they make their voices heard and they are talking together as a group and not isolated voices here and there, there is a real possibility for change. Even though when they come from different countries, even if we're talking, for example, about domestic violence, the kind of recommendations each group suggested was suited to their own problems in their own society, in their own country, but they all had some common features and differences as well. So I think we need to look at this period in the Muslim world as a period of upheaval. Jurisprudential upheaval, if you like. Have you ever heard that term before? So, legal upheaval, where they really see that there is an opening and a possibility of change. And I agree with that. And I think there should be leaders, therefore, who will lead change in the area, and hopefully Karamah will be cooperating with us.
Yes.
If I could just to answer from the perspective of the media, and again, just to address the issue of a disconnect. Now, without question, there are bad things that happen, in the Muslim world regarding women. But the way the media works is that it's a really tough job, particularly if you're in the journalistic world, because you always are on deadline. Even in the documentary world, you're always on deadline, and so you often go and write stories, and there are stories that have the prevailing storyline that people just gravitate to or seem to be interested in. You look for it and you present it, and therefore that's how stereotypes get reinforced over and over again. Like, for example, a few weeks ago we had the man who flew the airplane into the building. There's been hardly a stir of concern. No one's been nervous about that. There's no one shouting on television about, obviously had been a Muslim, probably been quite different. And we know that because a man lit a cigarette in the airport lavatory, and it was on CNN for 5 hours. It was going down, because that fit into the storyline. Guy with a Muslim name on an airplane doing something scary, that seizes our attention. So the issue of women, and you see this over and over again, and I think your statistic is very interesting about how the prevailing attitude, 80% or more, is that women, there's this deep gender inequality, not in society, but in attitudes. This is the prevailing storyline. So when people are out telling you what's going on in the Muslim world, I'm just using it as an example, but it could be other examples, but telling you what's going on, that is what they're often looking for. That is what then often gets repeated, reinforcing that storyline, reinforcing the stereotype, and make it more difficult for us to see. One of the things that I love about the Gallup poll is that it is a poll. It's scientific, it's comprehensive. It isn't just, because one of the things that when we make, and you saw our little previews there, I hope you're interested in some of our other films too, but one of the things that we would often get after a screening of one of those films is, well, yeah, but you're showing us only the good Muslims. What about the other ones? But the thing about the poll is it really is telling you what the Muslim worldwide think. And I think it's great to have these questions about, well, is the poll actually accurate? We always ask that, particularly if the poll doesn't agree with what we think about the situation. I'm sure you know that very well. But the point simply is, my contribution to this conversation is just to remember there's storylines, and storylines tend to be reinforced because they are widely held, and because they are widely held, they continue to be out there. And we have to really look at things like polling data to really help us break through those images and really understand really what's going on in a particular place in the minds of particular people.
Okay, yes, there.
My name is Robin, and I don't really know who all I'm asking this to, but I completely agree that the images that we see in media doesn't reflect a reality. It doesn't reflect reality anywhere. I mean, I was living in Kosovo, and my parents thought I was under siege on a hourly basis, and I wasn't, because the only thing they saw was when little things happened here and there. But when what's that? Little things? Well, I mean, not huge. I mean, anyway. So I guess what I'm thinking is that, Dalia, I wonder if it would be interesting to talk to people about women's issues in Muslim majority areas, talk to Americans about it by flipping it and talking about what this country has been through. Mm-hmm. And if you describe societies watching women being burned, and that was the Salem witch burnings. If you described police not responding to, distress calls, that's a domestic violence call in the United States, and then describes how the societies here in our country evolved. If that would make a change in how people think about things. And I also wanted to ask you if you think that could there be any kind of comparison, because while everything you're saying is true, the majority of people just go about their business every day and they care about their kids and their health and their jobs. But the statistics on women in earning money outside the home are very low, and we know that a lot of women are going to school, but then they end up with no jobs, and for that way, the economies are still not as progressive as we would like to see. Is there any comparison? Could you make a comparison or look at the context of the women's movement here and the evolution of our economy here with where those economies are at?
I can start. I think that's a really interesting point about comparisons. And I think comparisons are important and in terms of evolution and how things evolved, how things progressed here in the United States versus other parts of the world. And I really like your point about economics, because if you do look at our society, I think two things happened to really push the women's movement forward. And one was a booming economy. It was a demand on the part of our economy for women's labor. I come from the private sector, and the private sector doesn't sort of do things out of the goodness of their heart. When they brought women into the labor force, it was out of need, and it was because of a very strong, growing economy. So that's a force that's a societal force that helped push the women's movement forward. I think sometimes we believe that it was our social change that caused that labor penetration, where it actually probably happened in parallel. So I think it's important to not narrow our focus into just looking at one aspect of what pushed women forward in the United States and think it's only because we had a women's movement. That there were other things working for us that helped that forward that right now don't, in many cases, exist across Muslim majority countries. So I think socioeconomic forces have to be taken into account when we look at the progress of women in some of these societies.